So we came across the road to the blackberries. On the left, trailing blackberries, and on the right, we've got erect and semi-erect blackberries. You can see they're obviously standing more upright. So what's the deal on blackberries? First of all, we were just at the black raspberries. How do you tell the difference?
So the black raspberries are much more similar to a raspberry in terms of what the fruit looks like. So it's more like a little hat, and it's hollow on the inside. So that inside part of the berry is called the receptacle. And on a raspberry and a black raspberry, you pick the fruit off of that and the receptacle stays on the plant. Whereas with a blackberry, you pick the whole thing off. So here's a blackberry, and I don't know if you can see the inside of that, but that white part on the inside of the blackberry that you bite into, that's the receptacle, and that stays with the berry.
Interesting.
So that's kind of the biological difference between them. So they are related, but they have plenty of differences. So this is actually Columbia Star, which is one of the newer trailing blackberry varieties that's kind of getting marketed and grown as a replacement to the classic Marionberry, which everybody knows about in Oregon. The problem with Marionberry is that it's very thorny, and it's actually not very cold hardy. So if it gets below about 10 degrees in the wintertime, which doesn't happen often, but it can happen, that can damage the tops of the plants, which will reduce the crop in the following year. And it can even damage the roots if it gets down closer to zero, which can happen in parts of the valley on occasion. So Columbia Star is thornless. It's a little bit easier to deal with, easier to train. You don't have to worry about getting thorns in your fruit product if you're making a jam or a pie, so there's liability concerns there. It's really nice fruit quality also. So this one came out of the breeding program that's affiliated with USDA and OSU. So we're proud of this one, and we're doing research on it to figure out how to best grow it. But basically, these trailing blackberries, they get their name because the canes trail along the ground, which you can see a little bit down here. They're pretty flexible, and their habit is just to trail, and they can get wound around. And these will have any number of canes between 5 or 6 and 20 to 30, just depending on the variety. These typically during the growing season will get the primocanes that grow will get trained along the ground. Some of these have sort of been tied up into the plant just to get them out of the way at the end of the row here. So while the primocanes are growing on the ground, the floricanes are trained up on the wire. So these are the floricanes up here. Again, this is at the end of the fruiting season for this variety, or past the end of the fruiting season. So these are starting to die off. You can see the leaves turning brown and kind of yellow and getting crispy. So as that's happening, the plant is sucking nutrients back into the crown of the plants and the roots of the plants and storing that for later use. So these are going to die back, and then they get cut off down at the base. You can tell which canes you want to cut based on the color. So these are going to be more brown and kind of crunchy and hard, whereas the primocanes are going to be more green and sort of lush still. So those will get cut off, and then you take all the new primocanes and kind of wrap them around each other, and then they either get twisted in these loops like we've done here, or they get sort of braided up and down along the trellis wire. So there's a few different methods that people do them. The other way to grow these, so this is what we call an every year production system. So every year there's going to be fruit on the trellis and you're harvesting. And I think this is the most common way to do it, but the other way to do it is called an alternate year production system. And that's where you basically cut everything to the ground after it's fruited. The following year you just have primocanes growing, and then you only have to deal with primocanes. You don't have any fruit in that field at the same time. You train the primocanes up on the trellis as they grow, and then the year after that you'll do all the harvest, and then you start over. So you would have kind of two separate sections of the field. One is producing fruit on floricanes, and one is just primocanes, and then you'd switch them the following year. So they each have their advantages. Yields are fairly similar between the two overall. When you just have primocanes, you don't have to worry about spraying that field for pest control, quite as much disease. So there are advantages to both systems.
So the 2-year yield actually evens out with the every other year, then, you're saying?
I believe it's a little bit lower, but because you don't have floricanes, or don't have floricanes growing while the primocanes are growing, the plant is able to put all of its energy into those primocanes. So you get more canes, longer growth, and then your yield is higher on that year that they are producing fruit.
Cool.
So it does level out. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Balance itself that way.
Neat. And is that across blackberries or specifically for these?
For trailing blackberries,
Okay.
yeah. I think because these are more kind of mechanized and machine harvested, if you can keep the cost of production down as low as possible, that's kind of what the idea is. Whereas the erect and semi-erect are mostly for fresh market, hand-picked. So people tend to do those every year. You know, you always have a fruit crop on the plant.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. And then these guys over here?
Yeah, so this is Triple Crown. This is a semi-erect blackberry. And like we looked at, these canes are obviously much more upright. Typically, a grower would have more of like a T-bar in trellis in here, so maybe a cross arm, which would allow these canes to spread out a little bit. We don't have that set up here just because it gets more complicated because we're growing them all in the same field. But these can also be trained and sort of twisted around the wire, which is what we have here, but you have to be much more gentle with them because they are more erect and a little bit more brittle. So that's a little bit of a challenge. And if you have a cross arm, that allows you to spread those canes out, which can also the fruit isn't as crushed together, and that can be better for airflow and disease management also, and a little bit easier to hand pick if the fruit is spread out, whereas a machine can kind of knock the fruit off wherever it is. Just like in our black raspberries where we were tipping them, we want to do that in this type of plant also. Otherwise the canes can, again, they grow very, very tall. So we try and catch these around probably 3 feet tall and take 6 inches to a foot off of those canes, and then they will branch, and that just increases yield. We have more buds here that can have flowers and fruit the following year. And so these varieties, you can see these are just starting to get ripe. So they're sort of a mid to end of July into September. There might even be some that go a little bit later than that. But the primary season for them is August. That's the time when most of them are ripe. So a little bit later in the season, the trailing blackberries tend to be the end of June to early July, and then these ones take over. So it's nice. We have a kind of a good continuous supply of berries throughout the summer here, using these different types of plants.
Yeah, sounds like a nice progression. Always have fresh fruit.
Yeah, exactly. And these ones can be machine picked as well, but they tend to be, again, because of the primary type of blackberry that's grown here in terms of acreage is the trailing blackberries. They get machine picked for processed markets. So they're getting frozen, individual quick frozen or IQF, which are going into freezer bags, or they're going into jams, jellies, juice, all those sorts of things. There is a small percentage of those that get hand-picked for fresh market as well at grocery stores and farmers markets, whereas these ones are pretty much all grown for fresh market. They tend to be a little bit firmer, and there's just a lower amount of acreage grown here, so that's the main goal with them.
So what about the trailing makes them better for processing?
It's not necessarily that they're better for processing, but those are that's kind of the season. There's a lot of fruit all at once, so that's a good quality about them, is that they have a short growing season, so you don't have to keep machine picking them week after week after week after week. Whereas these are a little bit better for fresh market because they have a longer fruit producing season. So these ones are getting ripe now, but they're probably going to keep producing fruit for 4 weeks or so, maybe even longer for some of the varieties. Whereas things like Columbia Star, Marion, they've really got around a 2-week, maybe 2.5 week season. So it's very compressed, which is good for processing. You can harvest a lot of fruit at once, kind of get that off the plant and be done with it.
Seems like further down the chain too, then it's easier to schedule, I imagine, with the processor.
Yeah, so and it's just you can bring a larger volume at once and they deal with it then, rather than just continuously picking a small volume.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not just about the qualities of the fruit, it's
right.
also the timing.
Right, exactly.
Cool.